G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. First dog on the moon, 22nd of March. Happy Equinox.
Hello, Patriots. Welcome to First Dog on the Moon's Guide to Modern Living. I'm Walkley award-winning cartoonist for The Guardian Australia, First Dog on the Moon. This week, the Prime Minister has been eating hotties. Pretty much business as usual when it comes to good government. And we cross now live to the onion pot of a hard-working Australian family's pantry. I'm an onion, and I don't like it. And it's not just the onions of Australia who've had enough, it's all the other vegetables and possibly some of the people as well. This week we are in fact exactly halfway through the first government of the Abbott era. Or are we? Good government with the adults in charge is hurtling along, but it does look like some of the senior ministers are still unhappy because they keep leaking against the Prime Minister. Not literally, of course, that would be gross. But according to some senior ministers had a dinner with Tony last week. They probably ate a lot of onions. Delicious. And they talked about the possibility of having a double dissolution election. Then they said they didn't really mean it. But who even talks about that halfway through your first term? And aren't you supposed to call a double dissolution election when you're leading in the polls? Leading in the polls. It hasn't happened yet, and from Prime Minister Abbott, it might just be an onion too far. But what even is a double dissolution? It's different to a single dissolution in which the Prime Minister and every member of Cabinet are dissolved in a large vat of Andrew Bolt's tears, and they carve a whole new government out of soap, or in Peter Dutton's case, frozen pea and ham soup. And it's also quite different to a triple dissolution in which Parliament House itself is knocked down, the earth underneath is dug up and boiled, then it's all put back in place and wrapped in cling wrap. It's the easiest way to get rid of the swarms of bogong moths. Or you can just use a shotgun, which is a lot less effective, but much more fun. Hey, I got one. But we are talking about a double dissolution in which both houses of Parliament are dissolved rather than dissoluted, which is a silly word. Here is a fun fact. Did you know dissolute has two meanings? Firstly, for our purposes, it means dissipated or dissolved. And secondly, and quite pertinently, it also means indifferent to moral restraints, given to immoral or improper conduct, licentious, indulging in sensual pleasures. That certainly sounds like question time to me.
The member will remove himself under 94A.
And I think you'd all agree when I say Parliament's like that probably every day. A double dissolution is used to resolve deadlocks between the House of Representatives and the Senate. If certain constitutional conditions are met, Tony can go and ask Peter to dissolve both houses of Parliament and call a full election. Not Peter Credlin, obviously, Peter Cosgrove, the Governor-General. I'm sure Peter Credlin could dissolve Parliament if she wanted, and probably even half of Canberra. No doubt she has a satellite death ray in geosynchronous orbit over the ACT right now. How else could she get Tony to do and say all those stupid things? The trigger for a double dissolution is a piece of legislation being knocked back twice by the Senate. And there are a number of pieces of legislation that meet the criteria this time around. The first defeated bill was the Clean Energy Finance Corporation Abolition Bill 2014. That was knocked back for a second time in June last year. Then there was the Climate Changes and Even a Thing and Other Amendments Bill 2014. And finally, what is the opposition leader's name again? Is it Sturgeon Stumpy Shorten Bill 2014. But I'm sure that the double dissolution is dead, cremated, buried, dug up, cremated again, worn around your neck for a month, and then accidentally dropped down a drain. Which sums up the Prime Minister's whole approach, really. There's no doubt that if an election were called now, it would be the funniest thing to happen in federal politics since Peter Costello got his head caught in the pool fence at the Lodge Christmas party that time. And with that, we can certainly say democracy, or at least what's left of it, is safe for another week, unless it's dressed as an onion. Thanks for listening, Patriots. This has been First Dog on the Moon's Guide to Modern Living from the First Dog on the Moon Institute. You're welcome. Thank you.
Well, there you go. Malcolm Fraser died. And at about the same time that Christopher Pyne decided he was not actually going to sack 1,700 scientists, career research scientists, in a fit of spite because the opposition and the crossbenchers in the Senate refused to pass his deregulate the universities and stick all students who can't afford full upfront fees with completely crippling HECS debts, so that only the rich will be able to afford to send their kiddies to university bill, which is roughly what Christopher Pyne was trying to float. So yeah, we've got a little bit of science still yet occurring in Australia, but nobody wants to really work in an industry that's under a cloud of crony capitalist fascists and career bureaucrats like the one that Tony Abbott and apparently this Peter Credlin woman seemed to be running. Once upon a time, there was a lady called Juni Morosi who was considered the screw that held the Whitlam cabinet together. Peter Credlin is Tony Abbott's Juni Morosi, is she? Interesting question. I wonder what it means. Those of us with long memories will have to sort of suppress the urge to chortle too loudly. But the big thing this week was that pretty much all state-funded legal aid, women's shelters, domestic violence assistance units, particularly Aboriginal legal aid and community care programs for the poor have been defunded because the federal government didn't give the state government any money. And to stop people complaining about this earlier, everybody in those areas has been kept on a string by the government saying, oh, you know, like the consultation processes are still happening and we can't tell you who's got what money because consultation's still occurring. And a whole bunch of people last week got letters saying, congratulations, you've been successful in being funded by the government. And it's been sort of like, out of the $570,000 that you requested, you'll receive $15,000 of government funding and you'll just have to raise the rest yourself. So there's women's shelters and there's legal aid branches and there's legal assistance branches shutting down all over inland Australia. And this has been done by the Liberal branded government of crony capitalists who don't want to pay any tax. And because they don't want to pay any tax, they want to cut government spending in order to try and balance the books as they see it. They don't seem to pay any attention to the fact that all of their spending cuts are in areas that if you spend $1, it saves you about $50 worth of policing costs in trying to, you know, put a cordon around the riot that occurs when you don't have any legal system in place to deal with the domestic violence that suburban life generates in our post-Brady Bunch promiscuous society. If the people who are going to show up on Monday morning out the front of the courthouse on Mention Day, if they can't get legal aid to represent them, then they're going to go in there and represent themselves. And some people do well representing themselves in court. Others have a fool for a client. If you've got the magistrate, the court reporter, perhaps the police prosecutor, and the sheriff standing there trying to keep the peace between the same pair who on the weekend were drunk and disorderly and throwing crockery and swinging punches at each other and screaming at the top of their voices, it's not going to be a successful day in court. The whole idea of the British legal system was not to have the accused and the defendant yelling at each other. It was to have people who actually knew what the law was discussing what the issues were and have somebody else equally au fait with precedent and statute law decide which one of the people was telling the most of the truth and what actually probably happened and who's at fault and how much are they at fault and what were they thinking at the time, because the whole thing goes to what they call the mens rea, M-E-N-S-R-E-A, like the real mind. Was the person really trying to hurt, or was the person just doop-de-doo getting on with their day and not paying much attention? Is it culpable or is it negligent? Or is it willful? There's a lot of these things that letting the allegedly battered wife and the allegedly violent husband slug it out on the floor of the courtroom with no legal aid is not going to help things. Having the woman choose between being homeless and being battered because there are no shelters for homeless women, it's not an improvement. It tears apart the fabric of the society that these idiots are trying to govern at a profit for their mates in big busyness. They don't seem to have it through their heads that it is cheaper to pay the dole than it is to rebuild after a food riot. You put that together with Tony Abbott's theory that living in remote communities is a lifestyle choice that the taxpayer shouldn't have to fund because the taxpayer gets their entire GDP from the exploitation of a continent stolen at gunpoint and with bags of poison. It just doesn't get that. The reason that the Aborigines have been peaceful in Australia is because we were initially paying them with sugar, flour, tea, salt, and meat as rations, and they were allowed to stay on their land. And then we paid them a little bit of money, like maybe a quarter of what a whitefellow would have to be paid to, make a cattle industry happen in inland Australia. And then when we said they were full citizens and they were allowed to drink, that's when we said, well, we'll pay you the dole. And people were, they're able to live on their land and buy food in the shops, not have to go and steal it. The dole was invented to stop the poor from killing the rich. I'm convinced that they want to empty inland Western Australia so that it'll be fit for mining exploration and perhaps dumping radioactive waste. I think that's what's behind Tony Abbott's lifestyle policy, because he hasn't said anything about all the inland towns full of whitefellas who are being supported by the taxpayer, because the prime industry in town is Centrelink. And more people in the town live off Centrelink pensions than live off wages, then you've got a completely supported society. And, I live on the outskirts of a town like that. There's 10,000 people living in the town and the shire, and maybe 4,000 of them have got jobs. Everybody else is on a pension or they're a child. So let's hope Tony Abbott has delusions of adequacy and actually calls a double dissolution election, because I reckon he'll get a bloody shock. I reckon he'll get a big bloody shock, and hopefully a few more people will vote Green. Hopefully. Who knows? Who knows? We'll see what happens in New South Wales, because we've got a state election next week. And the Liberal, crony, capitalist, fascist government is planning on selling the last of the poles and the wires. I think they're going to keep the ones in the country because, nobody can be induced to buy them. Anyway, Warbles on a lot to YouTube. That's been the week. Ciao.